Hello. For the last 500 million years, plants have been miraculously creating energy from carbon dioxide and sunlight. Most plants have developed a way to store excess energy or sugars for use later, or to give their offspring a source of energy when they are ready to start their own life. Sugar being so attractive to all sorts of predators, plants figured out how to move these sugars into complex carbohydrate structures and then roll those up into starchy granules that most living bacteria and animals no longer care to eat. Water, heat, and enzymes provide the mechanism to restore those starch granules back into fermentable sugar through the process enzymatic hydrolysis. Let's dive in. Enzymatic hydrolysis opens the door to fermentation and distillation with our starches and grains, allowing us to greatly expand the number of available raw materials for us. Throw yeast on a grain and the yeast will die before consuming any of the grain. Creating or recovering the fermentable sugar from starches, especially those locked up in grains, takes not only enzymatic hydrolysis, but the additional steps of modification and gelatinization before that can happen. Now, our first step is modification, really only in play with our grains or seeds and not our vegetables. Our glucose has been turned into a long chain molecule, amylose, and some proteins gather around it, and another sugar molecule, amylopectin, is like a tangled up version of amylose. Its intricate branching structure and the linear amylose intertwine, and the proteins self-assemble into a net, like a woven bag, organizing our starch molecules and controlling access to them, basically protecting them. Modification is breaking open our bag of starches, usually by crushing them with heat or through enzymes. Germination releases enzymes that will break open the protein net, allowing access to the starch granules. Now, our starches are still all tightly bound up and are pretty much insoluble. The process of turning glucose into starch liberates H2O, so logically we need to get some H2O back in there. By exposing the starches to water, especially warm water, we have gelatinization. This step sees the starch granules start to unwind and untangle. Now that our starch granules are unwound and accessible, and if water is available, our little enzymes help the water go back into the starch, turning it back into usable glucose. These enzymes, called amylase enzymes, are not consumed in the process. They're just like little matchmakers that help make all this happen, and happen over and over again. Just a few can do a lot of this work, which is called hydrolysis. Different types of amylase enzymes do this job a little differently, and each has a favorite temperature and a favorite operating environment to do this enzymatic hydrolysis. If it's too cold, they go dormant; too hot, they will die. Now, where we get these amylase enzymes, or just called amylases, can be a choice, or it may be restricted given the spirit category that we are making. In European spirit production, the grains used to make our sugary liquid wort are often where these amylases come from. These are our endogenous enzymes. Now, almost all organisms, even us, make amylase enzymes to break down starches. But another great source for amylase enzymes is fungi, who can be enlisted to make a lot of them for us. This is more the tradition in Asia, and if the grains themselves don't provide our enzymes and they come from anywhere else, we call them exogenous enzymes. Now, our Scotch whiskey mandates endogenous enzymes. And while you can get amylases from other grains, barley is the popular and reliable source. Like many other plants, our grains like barley make seeds every year, and generally they have been tweaked or domesticated to make as many seeds and seeds of the right size and shape as possible. Every seed has all the ingredients for a new plant, but packaged up in a dormant stage and programmed to wait for conditions to be just right to be born, if you will. It has food in the form of our bound up starches, making up the most of the seed in what's called the endosperm. It has a protective shell called the husk, and against the shell, it has a store of enzymes called the bran. And then the baby plant itself is in there as the germ. If the plant were immediately to start growing, it would be faced with trying to get started during the fall or winter and most likely would die before it could mature and then propagate. We can take advantage of this programmed dormancy and extend it if we need to by just drying the seeds out and keeping them cool. So our first step, if you remember, is modification, or getting those bound up starches free from the net or mesh protein bag. This modification stage with barley is called malting. And yes, other grains can be malted, but barley does such a good job that we use it almost exclusively. Enzymes are our tool here, and they are already in that bran layer, ready to be deployed when the time is right. We put the seed in a warm and moist environment, simulating springtime, and the little grain wakes up. Now, any environment that is warm and wet is an invitation for bacteria or fungal infection. And since we have lots of little barley babies, we have to work hard to keep them from spoiling. And we also need to have them all wake up or sprout at the same time, because there's really no practical way to separate sprouted from still dormant baby barleys. But we don't want new barley plants. We just want our amylase enzymes and those starches free from that protein net. Thinking it's springtime, the seed is waking up, calling on those enzymes to release starches for energy to grow. The hard kernel has swollen up for moisture. A root or two pokes out, showing us that all the amylase enzymes are now being released and starches are beginning to be utilized for growth. Now we're still turning them to not only try to ensure consistent exposure to heat and moisture, but to keep those little roots from tangling up too much. As these roots get to about the length of the barley, we have now what we call green malt, basically a live malt. Hopefully we have timed it just right and provided the right conditions to have healthy little plants that haven't used up too much starch yet and have made available all the enzymes that we can use later. At this moment, we need to kill the plant and preserve those ingredients. We turn up the heat and hit the baby barley with warm, dry air to kill it. This process is called kilning. We no longer have green malt, but now we have malted barley. Those little roots dry up and we clean up the seeds, getting rid of any dust and rootlets, and are left with malted barley. This malted barley can be stored for many months in this state. How we kilned the green malt, as in how hot the air was, whether we used an aromatic smoke to provide that hot air, can all make for different types of malted barley, now often just called malt. If we are really aiming for maximum enzyme preservation and available starches, this type of malt is called distiller's malt. But a hot kilning can give us some nice nutty caramel flavors, or even a really dark malt with chocolate character. But that can also damage our enzymes. Maybe the flavor we are after is worth it. Often, we'll take a few different malts to get our recipe just right. So we have our amylase enzymes and we have starches in the malt. Next, we need to make them more accessible by crushing them in a process called milling. We have some practical considerations here as well. If we milled them into a fine powder, once we added water, it would turn into a thick porridge like cement. What we do instead is mill in a way to have particles of different sizes. The husks can be rough, and then the endosperm or the starches can be ground into almost flour. This ground up malt or milled malt is called grist. And depending on whether you're making beer or spirits, you might tweak the consistency of the grist. Milling has now made our enzymes and starches much more accessible. So now we can add the water and do the gelatinization or unwinding of the starches in what's called mashing. Our barley malt loves 63, 64C for that gelatinization and amylase enzyme efficiency. So our magic happens now, and the enzymes get to work with the water, converting starch to glucose. If we have good grist, good malt, and that perfect temperature, we can pretty much be done in an hour. The sweet liquid is drained from the tank. Those barley husks help with drainage here. This sugary liquid is called wort, and it gets cooled down to fermentation temperatures and sent quickly over to the fermentation tanks. Remember how attractive sugar is, so we need to protect it from bacterial contamination. And actually, we usually don't even wait for every last bit of starch to be converted before moving it. We know that we'll still get some enzymatic hydrolysis happening over in that fermentation tank. Our leftover mass in the mash tub still has some sugar stuck in that goo. So we blast some hot water through it a couple of times to get those out and send those over to the fermenter. This process is called sparging, and it makes sure, hot water, that we get even more gelatinization. This has been the story of barley malt, and if we are making single malt whiskey, this is how we have to do it. But what if we're making a grain whiskey or an American whiskey with multiple grains instead of just barley? Say we're using wheat and corn too. We almost always mill the barley separately and mill or grind up the corn and the wheat separately. The starch granules in different species of grains gelatinize at different temperatures. So we start with the highest temperature corresponding to what our particular grain needs. Then we continue to add whichever until we get down to our 63, 64C, and our barley and its enzymes can be added, and they will get to work on the starches from all the grains. Our wort now has multiple grains in it rather than just barley. Maybe we only have 5 to 10% barley in our grain recipe or our mash bill. In this case, we could likely be shopping for a malt that has been trained or bred to have a really good enzyme load, as we're not going to care so much about the starches just from the barley. In either case, we have used barley's amylase enzymes to perform our enzymatic hydrolysis to convert starches here, grain-based, into a fermentable sugary liquid. Now let's discuss other sources for enzymes for our hydrolysis. Maybe we don't have barley accessible, or maybe we found another way to acquire these enzymes with maybe even higher efficiency than barley-based amylase enzymes. These exogenous enzymes can be made by fungi, for instance, in highly controlled conditions and then provided for use in fermentation and distillation. While we'll dig deeper into these fungi and even bacteria that produce amylase enzymes in our shochu, baijiu, and soju lectures, we will at least cover the basics of the process here. Firstly, a difference between these fungi or filamentous fungi, named for the way they grow like a root structure or filaments through a starchy food source. These fungi don't ingest the starch to convert it, but their filaments break down the starches outside of their bodies by excreting amylase enzymes, so they can then consume the sugars and nutrients by absorbing those back through the filaments. As long as the starchy medium or food source is warm and damp enough, you can sprinkle fungal spores to seed the process, or if the fungus is already ambient, they can jump on a starch source that's become available. So by steaming a starch to gelatinize or unwrap those starches, these fungi can not only do modification to grains, but also enzymatic hydrolysis. We then can take our base starchy material, now full of amylase enzymes, and add it to more gelatinized or cooked starches. The fungal enzymes can perform the same thing that happens with malting in barley, and then also do the sugar conversion. Similar to storing malted barley, if we cool down and dry out the initial starchy base material, we can preserve these enzymes for later use. Chinese ku and Korean nuruk are dried out cakes of this material that can be stored for later use. Often the storage or maturation of these cakes can allow for more character development through bacteria and wild yeast infestations. In Japan, the fungi is often grown on grains of rice or other grains or little pieces of sweet potato and called koji. Also interesting here is the standard sequential process of European malting, then milling, mashing, and fermentation can be combined into a single process of what's called parallel fermentation. Discussed in the fermentation lecture more deeply, but since our fungi are already making sugar as well as amylase enzymes, we can have fermentation happening while the conversion is happening. Starches with enzymes go in, ambient or cultured yeast are added, and alcohol comes out. While seemingly simpler, balancing the sugar, starch, and enzyme ratios to have a successful fermentation does take quite a bit of experience and skill. Now, while we haven't discussed some of our other starchy raw materials, we will leave the discussion on fructans, for instance, or starchy vegetables like potatoes, to those lectures discussing our spirits made from those raw materials. They use exogenous or less frequently endogenous enzymes in a similar fashion regardless. Hopefully this lecture explained what endogenous enzymes are and how they are acquired, the concepts of modification through malting, and why we would choose one malt over another, and then the gelatinization process that then leads into enzymatic hydrolysis. This was also outlined in the scope of a grain-based fermentation. Then we discussed exogenous enzymes generated from fungi and how they metabolize starches and more accurately convert starches through excreting enzymes into the medium. Either choice brings enzymatic hydrolysis conversion of starches to sugars, allowing us to proceed to fermentation or possibly even ferment at the same time. See you next time.